Margaret Coleman stood in the empty kitchen of what used to be her home, holding a single cardboard box containing 30 years of memories. The granite countertops she had picked out, the custom cabinets she had designed, the breakfast nook, where she had served thousands of meals, all of it now belonged to someone else. Someone younger, prettier, and apparently more deserving of the life Margaret had built. The divorce papers crumpled in her free hand told a story that would make anyone's blood boil. After 3 decades of marriage, Richard Coleman had left his wife with nothing but the clothes on her back and a modest savings account. The house, the business, the investments, everything was gone. Or so it seemed. What Richard and his new 28-year-old wife Jessica didn't know was that Margaret Coleman had been playing a much longer game than anyone realized. And they were about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who has been quietly building an empire while pretending to be just a devoted housewife. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday. In the Coleman household, Margaret was already in the kitchen by 6 a.m., grinding fresh coffee beans and preparing Richard's breakfast exactly the way he had liked it for the past 30 years. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast with a thin layer of butter, and fresh orange juice in the crystal glass she had received as a wedding gift from her grandmother. "Morning, sweetheart," she called out as she heard his footsteps on the hardwood stairs. At 52, Margaret still moved with the grace of someone who had once been a dancer, though those dreams had been set aside long ago to support Richard's ambitions. Richard Coleman appeared in the doorway, adjusting his tie. At 55, he was still an attractive man, his salt and pepper hair giving him a distinguished look that had served him well in his real estate empire. "Thanks, Maggie," he said, using the nickname that had once made her heart flutter but now felt more like a habit than affection. She placed his plate on the breakfast table they had bought together during their 2nd year of marriage, when money was tight but hope was abundant. "I called the caterer about the anniversary party," Margaret said, settling into her chair with her own much smaller portion. "They can accommodate the 150 guests, and I confirmed the menu we discussed." Their 30th wedding anniversary was approaching in 2 months, and Margaret had been planning what she hoped would be a celebration of their enduring love. She had already ordered invitations with a photo from their wedding day, Richard handsome in his rented tuxedo, Margaret radiant in her mother's altered wedding dress. "About that," Richard said, not meeting her eyes as he cut into his eggs. "We might want to scale it back a bit. Business has been unpredictable lately." Margaret paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Richard's real estate company, Coleman Properties, had been thriving for the past decade. Just last week, he had mentioned closing on a major commercial development deal. "Is everything all right? You didn't mention any problems." "Nothing serious. Just some cash flow issues. You know how these things go." He reached across the table and patted her hand, the gesture feeling perfunctory. "Besides, at our age, do we really need a big party? Maybe something intimate would be better." She nodded, though something nagged at her. Richard had never been one to worry about money, especially not for their anniversary. But Margaret had learned over the years that questioning Richard's business decisions was a quick way to create tension, so she simply said, "Whatever you think is best." After Richard left for the office, Margaret began her usual routine. She had given up her job as a marketing coordinator 15 years earlier when Richard's business had taken off and he had insisted she focus on creating a beautiful home for them. At the time, it had seemed romantic, even practical. Now, she sometimes wondered what her career might have looked like if she had continued. The house was a testament to her efforts, a sprawling colonial in the prestigious Willowbrook neighborhood, with perfectly manicured gardens and interior design that had been featured in the local magazine twice. Every room told the story of their life together: the living room where they had hosted dinner parties, the home office where Richard occasionally worked late into the evening, the guest rooms that had remained optimistically ready for children who never came. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her sister Linda. "Lunch today. I have news." They met at Bistro Laurent, the French restaurant where Margaret and Richard had celebrated their 10th anniversary. Linda was already seated when Margaret arrived, practically vibrating with excitement. "You look like you're about to burst," Margaret said, sliding into the booth across from her younger sister. "David proposed." Linda held up her left hand, showing off a modest but beautiful solitaire diamond. "Can you believe it? At 45, I thought I'd missed my chance." Margaret's heart swelled with genuine happiness for her sister, who had gone through a difficult divorce 5 years earlier. "Linda, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. He wants to have the wedding next spring. Nothing huge, maybe 50 people. Will you be my matron of honor?" "Of course." Margaret squeezed her sister's hands. "Richard and I would be honored to be part of your special day." As they discussed wedding plans over salads, Margaret found herself thinking about her own wedding 30 years ago. She had been so young, so certain that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. Richard had been charming and ambitious, promising her a life of adventure and success. In many ways, he had delivered on those promises, but somewhere along the way, the adventure had become routine, and success had become more important than the relationship that had made it possible. "You're thinking about your anniversary party, aren't you?" Linda asked, misreading Margaret's contemplative expression. "Actually, we might be scaling it back. Richard's concerned about business expenses." Linda frowned. "But didn't you tell me he just closed on that big shopping center development?" "He did, but apparently there are some cash flow issues." Margaret pushed a piece of lettuce around her plate. "You know how business can be unpredictable." Linda's expression suggested. She wanted to say more but thought better of it. Instead, she changed the subject to wedding venues and flower arrangements. That evening, Margaret was in the garden when Richard came home, later than usual. She was tending to her prized rose bushes, the ones she had spent years cultivating into award-winning specimens. Gardening had become her passion during the quiet years, and their backyard was now the envy of the neighborhood. "How was your day?" she asked as he loosened his tie. "Long, complicated." He seemed distracted, checking his phone even as they spoke. "I might need to travel more in the coming months. There's a potential expansion opportunity in Chicago." Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Richard's business trips had become more frequent over the past year, leaving her alone in their big house more often than she cared to admit. "How long will you be gone?" "Hard to say. Could be weeks at a time." He finally put his phone away and seemed to really look at her for the first time that evening. "You'll be fine here. You've got your garden, your book club, all your activities." She nodded, though the prospect of even more time alone felt daunting. "Of course. I understand." Later that night, as Richard showered, Margaret sat at her vanity, removing her makeup and thinking about the conversation. She caught sight of herself in the mirror, still attractive, through the years had left their mark. Her brown hair, which she kept professionally colored to hide the gray, was pulled back in the simple style she had worn for years. Her face showed laugh lines and the beginning of crow's feet, evidence of a life lived but also of time passing. She opened the drawer of her vanity to put away her jewelry and paused at the sight of a small, leather-bound notebook tucked behind her jewelry box. It had been months since she had looked at it, but inside were records of something Richard knew nothing about, a secret that had been growing quietly for over a decade. Years ago, when Richard's business had first started to succeed, Margaret had been struck by a conversation with a wealthy client's wife who had been left with nothing after her husband's business collapsed. "Never put all your eggs in one basket," the woman had warned. "Always have something that's just yours." That advice had stayed with Margaret, and she had begun making small, careful investments using money from her household budget and occasional gifts from Richard. What had started as a few $100s in a separate savings account had grown into something much more significant through careful stock picks, a small rental property she had inherited from her aunt and renovated, and a few other quiet ventures. She closed the notebook without opening it. Richard was singing in the shower, oblivious to the fact that his wife was anything more than the devoted homemaker she appeared to be. And for now, that was exactly how Margaret wanted it. The next morning brought another normal breakfast, another kiss goodbye, another day of Richard at the office while Margaret maintained their beautiful life. But as she watched his car pull out of their circular driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface of their carefully constructed world. She spent the morning in her home office, a small room that Richard rarely entered, managing what she euphemistically called her personal projects. To anyone else, it might have looked like she was simply paying household bills and managing their social calendar. But Margaret was actually monitoring a portfolio that would have surprised anyone who knew her as simply Richard Coleman's wife. Her phone rang around noon. "Mrs. Coleman? This is Jessica Morrison from Coleman Properties. Mr. Coleman asked me to call and confirm that he won't be able to make it to dinner tonight. He's been called into an emergency meeting with investors." Margaret frowned. She hadn't known about any dinner plans, and Richard hadn't mentioned an emergency meeting. "I'm sorry, I think there might be some confusion. We didn't have dinner plans tonight." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Coleman. I must have misunderstood. Please disregard the call. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel." Now, back to where we left off. The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at her phone. Jessica Morrison. The name was familiar. Richard had mentioned hiring a new assistant a few months ago, someone young and capable who was helping him manage his expanding business. But something about the phone call felt odd, though Margaret couldn't quite put Her finger on what, she tried calling Richard, but it went straight to voicemail. "Hi, it's me. Your assistant called about dinner plans, but I think there was some confusion. Call me back when you have a chance." He didn't call back until late that evening, long after Margaret had eaten a solitary dinner and gone to bed with a book. "Sorry about the confusion today," he said, settling into bed beside her. "Jessica is still learning the ropes. She mixed up my schedule." "What emergency meeting?" Margaret asked, closing her book. "What? She mentioned you were called into an emergency meeting with investors." Richard was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could feel him thinking. "Oh, that." It ended up being nothing. Just some paperwork issues with the Chicago project. He kissed her forehead and turned away, effectively ending the conversation. But Margaret lay awake for a long time afterward, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand why her husband's explanation felt incomplete. The next few weeks passed in a similar pattern. Richard worked late more often, took more phone calls in private, and seemed increasingly distracted during their conversations. Margaret continued her daily routines, but she found herself paying more attention to the small inconsistencies in his behavior. One evening, while Richard was in the shower, his phone buzzed with a text message. Without thinking, Margaret glanced at it and felt her world tilt slightly off its axis. The message was from Jessica. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow night. I've missed you." Margaret stared at the screen until it went dark, her mind racing. The message could be innocent, maybe Jessica was a particularly friendly employee. But combined with the strange phone call and Richard's recent behavior, it painted a picture that made Margaret's stomach churn. She was still processing what she had seen when Richard emerged from the bathroom, toweling off his hair. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing her expression. "Fine," Margaret managed. "Just tired." But nothing was fine, and as she lay in bed that night listening to Richard's steady breathing, Margaret realized that the life she had carefully built and maintained for 30 years might be built on a foundation that was far less solid than she had believed. The woman who had always been known as simply Richard Coleman's wife was about to discover just how much power she had been quietly accumulating while everyone, including her husband, had been paying attention to other things. Margaret decided to surprise Richard with lunch at his office the next day. She had done this occasionally over the years, and he had always seemed pleased by the gesture. Today, however, she had an ulterior motive. She wanted to meet Jessica Morrison face to face and put her growing suspicions to rest. Coleman Properties occupied the entire third floor of the Meridian building downtown. Margaret had helped Richard choose the space 8 years ago when his business had grown enough to warrant impressive offices. The reception area still displayed the artwork she had selected, and the plants were ones she had chosen and occasionally came by to water. "Mrs. Coleman." The receptionist, Carol, beamed at her. "What a lovely surprise. Mr. Coleman didn't mention you were coming by." "It's a surprise," Margaret said, holding up the bag from Richard's favorite deli. "Is he in a meeting?" "Actually, he stepped out about an hour ago. Said he'd be back after lunch." Carol glanced at her computer screen. "But Jessica might know more about his schedule." "Jessica?" "His assistant. She's in the office next to his. Would you like me to get her?" Before Margaret could respond, a young woman appeared from around the corner, carrying a stack of files. She was stunning in the way that only 20-something women could be: glossy blonde hair, flawless skin, and a figure that her tailored business suit showed off to perfection. "Mrs. Coleman?" Jessica's voice was warm and professional, but Margaret caught something else in her expression, a flash of something that might have been guilt, quickly covered. "I'm Jessica Morrison. It's so nice to finally meet you. Richard talks about you all the time." Margaret forced a smile. "All good things? I hope." "Oh, absolutely. He's so proud of the home you've created together." Jessica's words were perfectly appropriate, but there was something in her tone that felt almost patronizing, as if she were humoring an elderly relative. "I brought Richard lunch," Margaret said, raising the bag. "Carol mentioned he stepped out?" "Yes. He had a last-minute meeting with a potential investor. Real estate never sleeps, you know." Jessica laughed, a tinkling sound that made Margaret feel suddenly old and frumpy. "But I'd be happy to put that in his office refrigerator. I'm sure he'll appreciate the gesture when he gets back." Margaret handed over the bag, noting how Jessica's manicured nails were painted the exact shade of red that Richard had once said he found attractive. "Thank you. Please tell him I stopped by." "Of course. And Mrs. Coleman? Richard mentioned you're planning your anniversary party. How exciting. 30 years is such an accomplishment." The way Jessica said it made 30 years sound like a prison sentence rather than a celebration. Margaret nodded and left, feeling more unsettled than when she had arrived. That evening, Richard came home with the empty lunch container and effusive thanks. "That was so thoughtful of you, Maggie. Jessica said you stopped by. I'm sorry I missed you. She seems very capable, Margaret said carefully. She is. Best assistant I've ever had. Really understands the business. Richard was sorting through his mail, not looking at Margaret as he spoke. Actually, she might be joining me on some of the Chicago trips. It would be helpful to have someone there who knows our processes. Margaret felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Of course. That makes sense. The following week, Margaret attended her monthly book club meeting at her friend Patricia's house. The group had been meeting for 12 years, and these women had become some of her closest friends. They were discussing a novel about a woman who discovered her husband's affair, and the conversation inevitably turned to personal experiences. I always said I'd know if Harold was cheating, said Susan Wright, adjusting her reading glasses. Women have intuition about these things. Do we, though? Asked Patricia, refilling wine glasses. I think sometimes we know but we don't want to know, if that makes sense. Margaret found herself speaking before she had planned to. What if you suspected something but weren't sure? What would you do? The room went quiet. These women had known Margaret for over a decade, and she was typically private about her marriage, always presenting it as strong and stable. Oh, honey, said Carol Stevens, reaching over to touch Margaret's arm. Are you asking for a reason? Margaret immediately regretted bringing it up. No, I was just thinking about the book. The character's situation. But the women exchanged glances that told Margaret they weren't convinced. Patricia, who had been divorced and remarried, spoke gently. Margaret, if you ever need to talk, you know we're here for you. And if you ever need practical advice. Well, I learned a lot during my divorce about protecting yourself financially. The words hung in the air, and Margaret realized that her friends had picked up on something she hadn't even fully acknowledged to herself yet. Later that week, Margaret was organizing Richard's home office while he was on his Chicago trip. She rarely went into the space, but he had asked her to find some tax documents for their accountant. As she searched through his filing cabinet, she came across a folder labeled Personal. Inside were credit card statements for an account she didn't recognize. Her hands trembled slightly as she scanned the charges: expensive dinners at restaurants she had never been to, a jewelry store purchase for $3,000 that she had never received, and a charge at a boutique hotel in Chicago that made her blood run cold. The dates corresponded with Richard's recent business trips. Margaret photographed the statements with her phone before carefully replacing them exactly as she had found them. Then she sat in Richard's leather chair and tried to process what she had discovered. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. The secret credit card, the expensive dinner for two, the jewelry purchase, the hotel room when Richard had claimed to be staying with business associates to save money. Combined with Jessica's presence at the office and the strange text message, the picture was becoming clearer. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She went to her home office and opened her secret notebook for the first time in months. The numbers staring back at her were more impressive than she had remembered. Through careful investing and the management of her inherited property, she had accumulated nearly $400,000 in assets that Richard knew nothing about. She thought about Patricia's words about protecting yourself financially. And for the first time, Margaret realized that she might need that protection sooner than she had ever imagined. The next morning, she called a lawyer, not the family attorney who had handled their wills and real estate transactions, but someone Patricia had recommended during her divorce. Margaret made an appointment under her maiden name, claiming she was asking for a friend. Attorney Diana Walsh was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in divorce cases involving significant assets. She listened without judgment as Margaret, claiming to be asking hypothetically for a friend, described a 30-year marriage where the wife suspected infidelity and was concerned about her financial security. Your friend should start documenting everything, Diana advised. Financial records, unusual behavior, anything that might be relevant. And she should get a clear picture of all marital assets, bank accounts, investments, real estate, business interests. Knowledge is power in these situations. Margaret nodded, taking careful notes. What if the husband owns a business? Business valuations can be complex, especially if there's any attempt to hide assets or inflate debts. Your friend should be prepared for that possibility. Diana leaned forward. The most important thing is that she protects herself. Too many women assume their husbands will be fair during a divorce, and they end up with nothing. Margaret left the lawyer's office with a list of tasks that felt overwhelming but necessary. She spent the next several days quietly gathering information about their finances, photographing documents, and creating copies of important papers. When Richard returned from Chicago, he seemed different, more distant, more secretive with his phone, and quicker to find fault with small things around the house. The lawn service did a terrible job this week, he complained, standing at the kitchen window. I'm thinking of switching companies. Margaret looked out at their perfectly manicured lawn. It looks fine to me. You're not seeing what I'm seeing, Maggie. There are details you miss. His tone was condescending in a way that felt new and hurtful. That evening, Richard announced he would be returning to Chicago the following week for an extended stay. This deal is getting complicated. I might need to be there for 2 weeks, possibly 3. That's a long time, Margaret said quietly. Business doesn't run on our personal timeline, Richard replied, not looking up from his laptop. Jessica will be coming with me. We'll need to work around the clock to make this happen. Margaret nodded and said nothing, but that night she made another appointment with Diana Walsh, this time using her real name and admitting that she wasn't asking for a friend. I think my husband is having an affair, she said, the words feeling strange and heavy in her mouth. And I need to know what my options are. Diana's expression was compassionate but businesslike. Tell me everything, Margaret. And don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem. As Margaret recounted the past few weeks, the strange phone calls, the credit card statements, Richard's changing behavior, and her growing certainty that something was terribly wrong, she realized that she was no longer the naive woman who had suspected nothing just a month ago. She was becoming someone else entirely. Someone who was prepared to fight for what was rightfully hers, and Richard Coleman had no idea what was coming. Margaret's world shattered on a Tuesday afternoon while she was repotting orchids in her greenhouse. Her phone rang, and she almost didn't answer it, her hands covered in soil. But something made her wipe them clean and pick up the call from an unknown number. Mrs. Coleman? This is Dr. Rebecca Martinez from Chicago General Hospital. Margaret's heart stopped. Is Richard okay? Has there been an accident? Mr. Coleman is fine, ma'am. I'm calling because you're listed as his emergency contact, and there was some confusion about his insurance information. He's here with his wife for a routine procedure, but, I'm sorry, Margaret interrupted, certain she had misheard. Did you say his wife? There was a pause on the other end. Yes, Mrs. Jessica Coleman. She's having some minor outpatient surgery. And Mr. Coleman wanted to make sure her insurance would cover. The doctor stopped mid-sentence. Oh my God. I think I've made a terrible mistake. The phone slipped from Margaret's numb fingers, clattering onto the greenhouse floor. She stood there, surrounded by the beautiful plants she had nurtured for years, as the truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. Richard was married to Jessica. While still married to her, her legs gave out, and she sank onto the wooden bench she had installed for moments of peaceful contemplation. Those moments seemed like they belonged to a different lifetime now. When she could finally move again, Margaret retrieved her phone and saw that Dr. Martinez had called back twice. She didn't listen to the voicemails. Instead, she walked back to the house on unsteady legs and sat in her kitchen, staring at the breakfast table where she had served Richard his eggs just that morning. The pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. The business trips to Chicago. Jessica accompanied him. The hotel charges on the secret credit card. The way Jessica had looked at her in the office, not with guilt, but with pity for the stupid woman who didn't know she had already been replaced. Margaret's phone rang again. This time it was Richard. Hey, Maggie, his voice was casual, normal. How's your day going? She almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Interesting. I got a call from a hospital in Chicago. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard, she said quietly. Are you there? I can explain, he said finally, his voice completely different now, strained, desperate. Can you? Can you explain why a doctor just referred to Jessica as your wife? Another silence. Then, we need to talk. I'm flying back tonight. Yes, Margaret said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. We definitely need to talk. She hung up and sat in the silence of her beautiful home, looking at all the things they had built together. 30 years of marriage reduced to a lie. She thought about all the times Richard had kissed her goodbye, told her he loved her, made plans for their future, all while building a secret life with another woman. Margaret called Diana Walsh. I need to see you immediately, she said when the lawyer answered. My husband is a bigamist. 2 hours later, Margaret sat in Diana's office, recounting the hospital call while the lawyer took furious notes. Bigamy is a felony, Diana said grimly. But our immediate concern is protecting you legally and financially. If Richard has been using marital assets to support his other household, you have grounds for a very strong case. What do I do when he comes home tonight? Document everything. Record the conversation if possible. Your state allows single-party consent. Don't let him know what you've discovered about your own assets yet. And Margaret? Diana's expression was serious. Be careful. Men who've been living double lives can become unpredictable when cornered. Margaret drove home in a daze. She stopped at an electronics store and bought a small digital recorder, then sat in her car in her own driveway, trying to prepare for A conversation she had never imagined having. The house felt different when she walked inside, like a stage set for a play she no longer understood her role in. She moved through the rooms, seeing everything with new eyes. The family photos on the mantel looked like lies. The bedroom they shared felt contaminated. The kitchen where she had made thousands of meals for a man who was living with another woman became unbearable. Margaret retreated to her home office and opened her secret notebook. The numbers that had once represented security now looked like salvation. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't be left with nothing. Richard's car pulled into the driveway at 9:30. Margaret positioned herself in the living room, the recorder hidden in her pocket, and waited. He walked in looking haggard, his usual confidence replaced by the demeanor of a man who knew his world was about to collapse. Maggie, how long? She interrupted. Richard stopped in the doorway. What? How long have you been married to her? He closed his eyes. 2 years. 2 years. While Margaret had been planning their anniversary party, Richard had been celebrating anniversaries with someone else. Do you love her? Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure why it mattered. Yes. The simple word hit harder than any elaborate explanation might have. Did you ever love me? Richard sat down heavily on the couch across from her. Of course I did. I do. This isn't about not loving you, Maggie. Then what is it about? He ran his hands through his hair. You don't understand. Jessica and we have something different. She understands my business, my ambitions. She makes me feel young again. Margaret stared at him. So you married her? While married to me? I never meant for it to happen this way. We went to Vegas for a business conference, and we were both drunk, and he stopped, realizing how pathetic his excuse sounded. And you never bothered to get it annulled. It's complicated, Maggie. There are business implications. Jessica's name is on some of my accounts now, and undoing it would raise questions with my investors. The casual way he spoke about business implications when discussing his bigamy made Margaret's blood run cold. So you were just going to keep us both? Your wife and your other wife? I was figuring it out, Richard said defensively. I was going to tell you eventually. When? At our anniversary party? Richard flinched. I was hoping we could handle this civilly. You'll be fine, Maggie. The house is paid off, you'll get your share of the assets. You can start over. The patronizing tone was back, the same one Jessica had used at his office. Margaret realized that they had probably discussed her together, planned how to handle the inconvenient first wife. Start over, she repeated slowly. At 52. After giving you 30 years of my life. People get divorced all the time. You're still young, still attractive. You'll find someone else. Margaret stood up, looking down at the man she had shared her life with, and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. You're right about one thing, Richard. I will be fine. Good. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. I haven't finished. I said I'll be fine. I didn't say you would be. Something in her tone made Richard look up sharply. What do you mean? Margaret smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. I mean that you've made the biggest mistake of your life. And you're about to find out exactly who you've been underestimating for 30 years. She walked to the door, then turned back. You should probably call a lawyer, Richard. You're going to need one. As she headed upstairs, leaving Richard sitting in stunned silence, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time in 30 years, she felt powerful, and she was just getting started. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in the guest room. She couldn't bear to sleep in their marital bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to Richard pace downstairs until nearly 3 a.m. When morning came, she found a note on the kitchen counter, gone to Chicago to sort things out. We'll talk when I get back. Arth, the coward, couldn't even face her for breakfast. Margaret made coffee for one and sat at the table where she had served Richard his last meal as her husband. The normalcy of the morning routine felt surreal given that her entire life had imploded. Less than 12 hours ago, her phone rang. Linda. Hey, Margaret. I wanted to run some wedding ideas past you. Are you free for lunch today? Margaret almost laughed. Her sister wanted to plan a wedding while Margaret's marriage was disintegrating in spectacular fashion. Actually, Linda, I need to tell you something. 20 minutes later, Linda burst through Margaret's front door with tears in her eyes and a box of tissues in her hands. That bastard, Linda said, pulling Margaret into a fierce hug. 30 years, and he throws it away for some child? 28 isn't exactly a child, Margaret said, though she appreciated her sister's outrage. She's young enough to be his daughter. And married? While married to you? Linda paced around Margaret's kitchen like a caged animal. We're calling Mom and Dad. And I'm canceling lunch with David so I can help you figure this out. No, Margaret said firmly. Don't cancel your plans. And don't call our parents yet. I need to handle this strategically. Linda stopped pacing and stared at her sister. Strategically? Margaret, you sound different. I feel different. Margaret poured Linda a cup of coffee. For 30 years, I've been Richard Coleman's wife. I've defined myself by that relationship, made all my decisions based on what was best for us, for him. I forgot who I was before Richard. Who were you before Richard? Margaret smiled, and for the first time in years, it felt genuine. I was the woman who graduated summa cum laude with a business degree. Who was promoted to senior marketing coordinator in less than 2 years. Who once managed a campaign that increased sales by 30%. She paused. I was somebody. I just let myself forget that. Linda sat down heavily. Oh, honey. You've always been somebody. Not in Richard's world. In his world, I was decorative. Useful for hosting dinner parties and maintaining a beautiful home, but not someone whose opinions mattered when it came to real decisions. Margaret's voice grew stronger. But that woman who built something significant while he thought I was just playing house? She's still here. And she's angry. That afternoon, Margaret drove to Diana Walsh's office with a briefcase full of documents she had spent the morning gathering. The lawyer's eyes widened as Margaret spread financial records across the conference table. This is impressive work, Diana said, reviewing Margaret's documentation. You've essentially built a complete picture of your marital assets in less than 24 hours. I have a business degree and 30 years of managing our household finances, Margaret replied. I know where every penny is. What about these? Diana pointed to copies of bank statements Margaret had never seen before. Those are Richard's secret accounts. I found the statements in his office and did some investigating this morning. He's been siphoning money from the business into personal accounts that I'm not on. Margaret's voice was calm, but her eyes were hard. Approximately $200,000 over the past 2 years. Since he married Jessica. Exactly. Margaret opened another folder. I also called the hotel where they've been staying in Chicago. They've been registered as Mr. and Mrs. Coleman for the past 18 months. Diana whistled low. Margaret, you could teach my investigators a thing or two. I'm just getting started. Margaret pulled out her phone and played the recording from the previous night's conversation. Diana listened intently as Richard's voice filled the room, admitting to the bigamy and his cavalier attitude about handling this civilly. This is gold, Diana said when the recording ended. But I have to ask, are you prepared for how ugly this might get? Richard's going to fight dirty when he realizes what he's up against. Margaret thought about the past 30 years. The dreams she had given up. The career she had abandoned. The nights she had lain awake wondering why she felt so invisible in her own life. Let him try. That evening, Margaret was organizing her evidence when her doorbell rang. She opened it to find Jessica Morrison standing on her doorstep, looking perfectly put together despite the circumstances. Mrs. Coleman, I think we should talk. Margaret stepped aside to let her in, curious about what Richard's other wife had to say. Jessica walked into the living room with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. I want you to know that none of this was meant to hurt you personally. How thoughtful, Margaret replied dryly. Richard and I, what we have is special. He's told me all about your marriage, how you grew apart over the years, how he's been unhappy. Margaret studied Jessica's flawless makeup and designer clothes. Has he mentioned that bigamy is a felony? Jessica waved a dismissive hand. That's just a technicality. Our Vegas ceremony wasn't legally binding anyway since he was already married. It was more symbolic. Margaret blinked. You know he's been telling people you're legally married, right? Including doctors who called me thinking I was his ex-wife. For the first time, Jessica looked uncertain. What do you mean? I mean Richard has been representing himself as married to you for 2 years. He's put your name on bank accounts as his spouse. He's been filing fraudulent paperwork. Margaret's voice was steady. Whether your ceremony was legally binding or not, he's committed fraud by claiming it was. Jessica's composure cracked slightly. That's not what he told me. Richard tells people what they want to hear. Surely you've noticed that by now. Jessica straightened her shoulders, trying to regain her advantage. Regardless, he's chosen me. He wants to be with me. The mature thing would be for you to step aside gracefully. Margaret almost admired the younger woman's audacity. Step aside gracefully from my own life? You have to see that this marriage has been over for years. Richard needs someone who understands his world, someone who can help him grow his business. You're holding him back. Interesting theory. Margaret stood up. Tell me, Jessica, what exactly do you think Richard's business is worth? Coleman Properties? It's one of the most successful real estate companies in the state. Richard's a millionaire several times over. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. And you believe that because Richard told you so? I've seen the books. I'm his assistant. You've seen the books he's shown you. Margaret walked to her briefcase and pulled out a folder. Tell me, in all your time managing Richard's affairs, have you ever seen documentation for the mortgage on this house? Jessica looked confused. What mortgage? Richard said the house was paid off. It is. I paid it off. With money from my personal investments. Margaret opened the folder. This house is in my name only. I bought it before we were married, and Richard never contributed a penny to the mortgage payments. She could see Jessica processing this information, trying to reconcile it with what Richard had told her. You see, Jessica, Richard is very good at making people believe what serves his purposes. He told you this house was ours when it's actually mine. He told you he was legally married to you when he wasn't. He told you I was just a housewife when I'm actually the owner of a successful rental property business and an investment portfolio worth nearly $500,000. Jessica's face had gone pale. That's impossible. Is it? In 30 years of marriage, did Richard ever actually ask about my day? Did he ever wonder how I spent my time when he wasn't here? Did he ever question where I got the money for my household expenses? Margaret smiled coldly. He assumed I was doing nothing because that's what he wanted to believe. It made him feel important. Jessica stood up abruptly. I don't believe you. You don't have to. But you might want to ask yourself what else Richard has lied to you about. Margaret walked Jessica to the door. And Jessica? You might want to get your own lawyer. Because when I'm done with Richard, there won't be much left for anyone else. After Jessica left, Margaret poured herself a glass of wine and sat in her garden, surrounded by the roses she had spent years cultivating. For the first time in decades, she felt like herself again. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Talk to Jessica. We need to discuss terms when I get back. Margaret smiled and typed back, yes, we do. Looking forward to it. She wasn't the same woman Richard had left behind that morning. And he was about to find out exactly who he had been living with for 30 years. Margaret spent the next 3 days transforming from the woman Richard thought he knew into someone entirely different. She started by calling her old mentor, Thomas Brennan, who had been her supervisor at the marketing firm 20 years ago. Margaret Sullivan? Tom's voice was warm with surprise. My God, I haven't heard from you in ages. How are you? Margaret smiled at hearing her maiden name. I'm about to be Margaret Sullivan again, actually. Tom, I need a favor. Anything. You were one of the best people I ever worked with. I always wondered what happened to you. I got married and disappeared into domestic life. But I'm back now. And I need to know if Coleman Properties has been trying to secure any major investors recently. There was a pause. That's oddly specific. Why do you ask? Because my soon-to-be ex-husband owns it, and I suspect he's been inflating his assets to attract investors while hiding debts. Jesus, Margaret. You're talking about fraud. I'm talking about Richard Coleman. And yes, I think that's exactly what I'm talking about. Tom was quiet for a moment. Give me 24 hours. I still have contacts in commercial real estate. The next morning, Margaret was organizing her evidence when Diana Walsh called. I have news, the lawyer said without preamble. I had a private investigator do some digging on Coleman Properties. Your instincts were right. Margaret set down her coffee. How bad is it? Bad. Richard has been using the business as a personal ATM while massively overstating its value to potential investors. The Chicago deal he's been working on? It doesn't exist. He's been using fake contracts to justify transferring money to his personal accounts. Margaret felt a cold satisfaction settle over her. What else? The business is essentially insolvent. He owes more than it's worth, and he's been covering it up with creative accounting. Diana's voice took on a grim tone. Margaret, I think. He was planning to divorce you and disappear with whatever liquid assets he could grab. Well, Margaret said calmly, that's not going to happen. That afternoon, Margaret drove to her rental property, a beautifully renovated duplex in the historic district that generated steady monthly income. She had purchased it 15 years ago with money from her late aunt's estate, telling Richard. It was just a small inheritance she wanted to play with. In reality, she had seen the property's potential immediately and had spent years overseeing its renovation and management. The current tenants, a young professional couple, greeted her warmly. They had no idea their landlord was Mrs. Richard Coleman. Margaret had always used her maiden name for business purposes. Mrs. Sullivan, perfect timing, said David Chen, one of the tenants. We wanted to talk to you about extending our lease. For another 2 years. Margaret smiled. I'd be delighted to discuss that. The monthly rent from this property alone was more than many people's salaries, and she had been quietly saving and reinvesting the income for over a decade. After meeting with her tenants, Margaret stopped by the bank where she maintained her personal accounts Richard had never known existed. She had been banking under her maiden name since before their marriage, initially just to maintain some financial independence, but over the years it had become the foundation of her secret empire. Mrs. Sullivan, her financial advisor, Karen Mitchell, stood to greet her. "I was just reviewing your portfolio. The tech stocks we discussed last quarter have performed exceptionally well." Margaret settled into the chair across from Karen's desk. "I need to liquidate some assets. I'm going through a divorce, and I want to be prepared for anything." Karen's expression turned professional. "How much liquidity do you need?" "Everything. That can be converted quickly without major penalties." Karen pulled up Margaret's accounts on her computer. "That would be approximately $320,000 available within 48 hours, and another $150,000 within 2 weeks if we sell the municipal bonds." Margaret nodded. "Do it." That evening, Margaret was reviewing financial documents when her doorbell rang. Richard stood on the doorstep with 2 suitcases, looking haggard and defeated. "Can I come in?" he asked. Margaret stepped aside. "Of course. It's still your house too. For now." Richard set his suitcases down in the entryway. "Jessica told me about your conversation." "Did she? And what did she tell you?" "She said you were lying about owning the house. About having money." Richard's voice carried a note of desperate hope. "I told her you were just trying to upset her." Margaret walked to her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Here's the deed to this house, Richard. Notice that only my name is on it." She handed him the document. "I bought this house 6 months before we got married, using money I had saved from my job. You never contributed to the mortgage payments because I told you it was handled by my family trust." Richard stared at the deed, his face going white. "That's impossible. We've lived here for 30 years. We've lived in MY House for 30 years. You just assumed it was ours because that's what you wanted to believe." Margaret pulled out another document. "Here's the title to the rental property I've owned for 15 years. The one that generates $4,800 a month in income." Richard sank onto the couch, still staring at the papers. "I don't understand." "Of course you don't. You never asked, Richard. In 30 years, you never once asked how I spent my days, what I did with my time, where the household money came from when your business had slow periods." Margaret's voice was steady but cold. "You assumed I was doing nothing because that's all you thought I was capable of. But the household accounts, the credit cards, are funded by my rental income and investment returns. Richard, I've been financially supporting this household for over a decade while you've been draining money from your business to fund your affair." Richard looked up at her with an expression she had never seen before: fear. "How much?" "How much what? How much money do you have?" Margaret smiled. "Enough." Richard ran his hands through his hair. "Maggie, we can work this out. I made mistakes, but we can fix this." "No, Richard. We can't." Margaret sat down across from him. "Because I've also discovered that your business is bankrupt. You've been using it as a personal ATM while lying to investors about fake deals. The Chicago project doesn't exist, does it?" Richard's silence was answer enough. "Tom Brennan sends his regards, by the way. He says you tried to pitch him on investing in Coleman Properties last month. Claimed you had $20 million in assets." Margaret's smile was sharp. "Tom does due diligence on all potential investments. He knows your company is worthless." "You talked to Tom?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper. "I talked to Tom. I talked to private investigators. I talked to people you tried to defraud." Margaret leaned forward. "Richard, you're not just looking at divorce proceedings. You're looking at criminal charges." Richard buried his face in his hands. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something very clearly. The woman you thought you married, the helpless housewife who would be lost without you, she never existed. I've been building a life and a fortune while you've been building lies." Margaret stood up. "Tomorrow, you're going to call your lawyer and we're going to discuss terms. But understand this, I'm not some abandoned wife begging for scraps. I'm a businesswoman who's been planning for contingencies you never saw coming." Richard looked up at her, and for the first time in 30 years, Margaret saw respect in his eyes. It was too late, but at least it was there. "Where will you stay tonight?" she asked. I don't know. Jessica's lease is in Chicago, and I can't afford a hotel right now." Margaret felt a moment of something that might have been pity. "The guest room is made up. But Richard? Tomorrow, everything changes." As she headed upstairs, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: complete control over her own destiny. And it felt absolutely intoxicating. Margaret woke the next morning to find Richard already gone from the guest room. A note on the kitchen counter read, "Meeting with a lawyer at 10 a.m. We'll call you later." She crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. After 30 years of marriage, he was still trying to control the narrative. Her phone rang at 9:30. Diana Walsh. Margaret, we have a problem. Richard's lawyer just called wanting to schedule mediation for next week. He's claiming financial hardship and asking for spousal support. Margaret nearly choked on her coffee. He wants me to pay him? It gets worse. They're claiming that since the house is in your name, you've been hiding assets throughout the marriage. They want to audit your finances going back 20 years. Margaret set down her cup carefully. Let them try. At 10:15, her phone rang again. This time it was Tom Brennan. Margaret, you need to know something. Richard showed up at my office this morning with his lawyer, demanding I retract any statements I made about his business dealings. What did you tell them? I told them I don't retract facts. But Margaret, they're desperate. Richard was practically begging me not to talk to any investigators. Tom's voice was grim. He also offered me a partnership in Coleman Properties. If I would invest $2 million immediately. Margaret closed her eyes. He's trying to use investor money to fund his legal defense. That's what it looks like. I recorded the conversation, by the way. Thought you might want a copy. Tom, you're a saint. No, I'm a businessman who doesn't like being played for a fool. And Margaret? There's something else. I made some calls. After we talked yesterday, Richard has been approaching multiple investors with the same deal, claiming he needs bridge financing for the Chicago project. How many investors? At least 6 that I know of. He's trying to raise $12 million based on completely fabricated contracts. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. That's not just fraud anymore. That's running a Ponzi scheme. That afternoon, Margaret's doorbell rang. She opened it to find Jessica Morrison, but this wasn't the confident young woman who had visited 3 days earlier. Jessica looked like she hadn't slept, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and her eyes red-rimmed. May I come in? Jessica asked quietly. Margaret stepped aside, curious about what had brought Jessica back. Jessica sat on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling slightly. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. All right. Did Richard really commit fraud to be with me? Margaret studied the younger woman's face. What makes you ask that? I went to the Chicago hotel where we've been staying. The manager told me Richard's credit card was declined last week, and they've been covering the charges waiting for payment. Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper. He told me his company was paying for everything. Jessica, Richard's company doesn't have any money. It's been functionally bankrupt for months. But the business trips, the investor meetings, were Richard trying to find people to give him money to cover his debts. Margaret sat down across from Jessica. How much do you know about the work you've been doing for him? Jessica pulled out her phone and showed Margaret a series of documents. He had me prepare these investor packets. I thought they were legitimate business proposals. Margaret scrolled through the fake contracts, forged bank statements, and fabricated financial projections. Jessica, these documents constitute securities fraud. If investigators find these on your computer or in your emails, you could be charged as an accomplice. The color drained from Jessica's face. But I didn't know they were fake. Can you prove that? Jessica stared at the phone in horror. What do I do? You get your own lawyer. Immediately. And you cooperate fully with any investigation. Margaret handed the phone back. Jessica, Richard has been using you as much as he's been using me. The difference is, he set you up to take the fall for his crimes. Jessica broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands. I thought he loved me. I thought we were building a life together. Richard loves Richard, Margaret said quietly. Everyone else is just useful until they're not. After Jessica left, Margaret called Diana Walsh with an update. She's going to flip on him, Diana said after Margaret recounted the conversation. A young woman facing federal charges because of her married boyfriend's schemes? She'll cooperate to save herself. Good. What about our divorce proceedings? That's the interesting part. Richard's lawyer called again an hour ago. They want to meet tomorrow to discuss settlement terms. Diana's voice carried a note of satisfaction. I think someone told Richard about the criminal investigation. The next morning, Margaret walked into the conference room at Diana's law firm to find Richard sitting across from a lawyer she didn't recognize. Apparently he couldn't afford his usual attorney anymore. Richard looked like he had aged 10 years in the past week. Mrs. Coleman, Richard's lawyer, a thin man named James Porter, stood as she entered. I'm hoping we can reach an amicable agreement today. Margaret took her seat without acknowledging him. She looked directly at Richard. I'm listening. Porter shuffled through his papers. My client is prepared to offer you 50% of the marital assets, including half the value of Coleman Properties, in exchange for a quick, quiet divorce. Diana leaned forward. What exactly do you value Coleman Properties at? Current Market assessment puts it at approximately $8 million. Margaret laughed, actually laughed out loud. Richard, are you serious right now? Richard spoke for the first time. Maggie, please. I know I made mistakes, but we can both walk away from this with something. Something? Margaret opened her briefcase. Let me explain what's actually happening here. Coleman Properties has a negative net worth of approximately $3 million. Richard has been running a Ponzi scheme, defrauding investors, and committing tax evasion. She placed a stack of documents on the table. The FBI's white-collar crime unit opened an investigation yesterday morning. Porter went pale. We weren't aware of any federal investigation. Of course you weren't. Because Richard hasn't been honest with you either. Margaret pulled out another folder. Richard, you owe back taxes of $400,000. You've defaulted on business loans totaling $1.2 million. And you've been using marital assets to fund personal expenses, including maintaining a second household. She turned to Porter. Your client isn't offering me 50% of marital assets. He's trying to make me responsible for 50% of his debts. Richard slumped in his chair. What do you want, Maggie? I want you to sign a full financial disclosure under oath. I want you to liquidate any remaining business assets to pay back the investors you've defrauded. I want you to take full responsibility for all marital debts. Margaret's voice was steel. And I want you to stay away from me for the rest of your life. And in return? Porter asked weakly. In return, I don't press additional charges for the money you stole from our household accounts. I don't sue you for fraudulent misrepresentation during our marriage. And I might consider not testifying against you in your criminal trial. The room was silent except for the sound of Richard's ragged breathing. Richard, Margaret said softly. You spent 30 years thinking I was nothing without you. You were wrong. You're nothing without me. Porter whispered something to Richard, who nodded miserably. We'll need time to review these terms, Porter said. You have 24 hours. Diana replied. After that, the offer expires and we proceed with full litigation. As they filed out of the conference room, Richard caught Margaret's arm. Maggie, I never meant for any of this to happen. She looked down at his hand on her arm, then back at his face. Yes, you did, Richard. You meant for all of it to happen. You just never meant to get caught. She pulled free and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the hallway. For the first time in 30 years, Margaret Coleman was exactly where she wanted to be. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the kitchen of her home, now legally and officially her home, reading the morning newspaper over coffee. The headline on the business section made her smile. Local real estate developer sentenced to 5 years for investment fraud. Richard Coleman had pleaded guilty to securities fraud, tax evasion, and running an illegal investment scheme. The article detailed how he had defrauded investors of nearly $8 million while maintaining a bigamous relationship. What it didn't mention was that his ex-wife had been instrumental in building the case against him. Margaret's phone rang. It was Diana Walsh. Have you seen the news? Diana asked. Just finished reading it. 5 years seems appropriate. Jessica. Morrison got probation and community service for cooperating with prosecutors. Smart girl, she gave them everything. Margaret had felt a grudging respect for Jessica's decision to testify against Richard. The young woman had lost her job, her reputation, and her illusions, but she had chosen to tell the truth when it mattered. What about the investors? Margaret asked. Richard's assets are being liquidated to pay restitution. They'll recover about 30 cents on the dollar. Diana paused. Margaret, I have to say, I've never seen anyone handle a situation like this with such precision. You essentially orchestrated his entire downfall. I simply revealed who he really was, Margaret replied. Richard destroyed himself. I just made sure he couldn't take anyone else down with him. After hanging up, Margaret walked through her house, seeing it with fresh eyes. Over the past 6 months, she had made changes, subtle at first, then more dramatic. The formal dining room where she had hosted countless dinner parties for Richard's business associates was now a bright office space where she managed her expanding investment portfolio. The master bedroom had been completely redecorated. Gone were the heavy masculine furnishings Richard had preferred, replaced with elegant pieces that reflected Margaret's own taste. She slept peacefully there now, without the weight of lies pressing down on her dreams. Margaret had also made changes beyond the house. 3 months ago, she had quietly launched Sullivan Property Management, a company specializing in residential real estate investment. Using her maiden name felt like reclaiming a part of herself that had been dormant for too long. Her first major acquisition had been the building that used to house Coleman Properties. Richard's creditors had been eager to sell, and Margaret had gotten it for 40 cents on the dollar. The irony wasn't lost on her. She now owned the space where Richard Had built his house of cards. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret opened it to find Linda standing there with a bottle of champagne and a huge grin. "Justice is served," Linda announced, holding up the newspaper. "I brought champagne to celebrate." "It's 10 in the morning," Margaret laughed. "It's 5 o'clock somewhere, and besides, this calls for celebration." Linda pushed past her sister into the kitchen. "I still can't believe you knew about his crimes before anyone else." "I didn't know about them. I just knew Richard well enough to recognize when he was lying." Margaret got out champagne glasses. 30 years of marriage teaches you to read the signs." Linda popped the cork. "So what's next for the newly independent Margaret Sullivan?" Margaret accepted a glass and thought about the question. "I've been invited to speak at a conference next month about women and financial independence. Apparently, my story has gotten around." "What story?" "The woman who spent 30 years being underestimated while building a secret empire." Margaret raised her glass. "Turns out a lot of women find it inspiring." They clinked glasses, and Margaret felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the champagne. For the first time in decades, she was excited about the future. That afternoon, Margaret drove to her rental property to meet with potential new tenants. The young couple, both recent graduates starting their careers, reminded her of herself. At that age, full of hope and ambition. "The location is perfect," the woman, Sarah, said as they toured the renovated space. "But I have to ask, the rent seems below market rate for this area." Margaret smiled. "I prefer tenants who are building their lives rather than those who already have everything. Besides, I remember what it was like to be starting out." As she finalized their lease agreement, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Coleman, this is Jessica Morrison. I saw the news about Richard's sentencing. I wanted to thank you for encouraging me to get my own lawyer and tell the truth. You saved my life. I hope you're well." Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "It's Ms. Sullivan. Now. And you saved your own life by making the right choice. Good luck to you." That evening, Margaret was in her garden when her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, came over with her usual offering of fresh vegetables from her garden. "I saw the news about your ex-husband," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "I hope you're doing all right." "I'm doing better than all right," Margaret replied, deadheading her prize roses. "I'm doing exactly what I want to do. You seem different these past few months. Lighter, somehow." Margaret paused in her gardening. "I think I forgot who I was for a while. It's nice to remember." Mrs. Patterson nodded knowingly. "My late husband used to say that some people spend so much time being what others expect them to be, they forget they have choices." That night, Margaret sat in her home office, reviewing investment reports and planning her next property acquisition. Her portfolio had grown substantially since the divorce, partly from smart investments but mostly from the freedom to make decisions without having to consider Richard's ego or schemes. A knock at her front door surprised her. It was nearly 9 o'clock. She found Tom Brennan standing on her doorstep with a bouquet of flowers and a big smile. "Tom? What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood and saw your lights on. Thought I'd stop by to congratulate you on today's news." He handed her the flowers. "Also, I have a business proposition." Margaret invited him in, curious about what her old mentor had in mind. "I've been watching what you've built over the past 6 months, Tom said, settling into her living room. "Sullivan Property Management is impressive. You've acquired 4 properties, increased their value through smart renovations, and maintained 100% occupancy." "Thank you. It's been rewarding work. I represent a group of investors who are looking for someone to manage a real estate investment fund. We're talking about a $50 million portfolio." Tom leaned forward. "We want you to run it." Margaret set down her wine glass. "Tom, that's incredibly flattering, but I've only been doing this for 6 months." "Margaret, you've been doing this for 15 years. You just did it quietly. We've done our research, your track record is impeccable." Tom smiled. "Besides, after watching how you handled Richard's situation, we know you can handle anything." Margaret thought about the offer. 6 months ago, she had been a woman whose biggest decision was what to serve for dinner. Now she was being offered the chance to manage a $50 million investment fund. "I'll need complete autonomy over investment decisions," she said finally. "Agreed. And I want to focus on properties that provide affordable housing options. Not just maximum profit." "We figured you'd say that. It's part of why we want you." Margaret extended her hand. "Then let's talk about the details." As Tom left an hour later with a preliminary agreement, Margaret realized that her life had become something she never could have imagined a year ago. She wasn't just surviving Richard's betrayal, she was thriving beyond anything she had thought possible. The woman who had served breakfast to a lying husband every morning for 30 years was gone. In her place was Margaret Sullivan, businesswoman, investor, and someone who would never again define herself by someone else's limitations. 2 weeks later, Margaret was preparing for her first major speaking engagement at the Women's Financial Independence Summit in Atlanta. The organizers had specifically requested her story after word spread through professional networks about the housewife who had secretly built a fortune while exposing her husband's crimes. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the navy blazer she had chosen for the event. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the Margaret Coleman who had served breakfast in a bathrobe just 8 months ago. Margaret Sullivan had confidence in her posture, determination in her eyes, and the quiet satisfaction of someone who had taken control of her destiny. Her phone rang as she was gathering her presentation materials. The caller ID showed a number from the women's prison where Richard was serving his sentence. "This is a collect call from an inmate at." Margaret hung up before the automated message finished. Richard had been trying to reach her for weeks. But she had no interest in whatever manipulation he was attempting now. That chapter of her life was permanently closed. The flight to Atlanta gave Margaret time to review her speech one final time. She had titled it, "The Power of the Invisible Woman," and as she read through her notes, she thought about how many women in the audience might be living versions of her former life, talented, capable women who had made themselves small to accommodate someone else's ego. The conference was held at the Ritz-Carlton, and as Margaret checked in, she was struck by how comfortable she felt in this environment. A year ago, she would have felt intimidated by the luxury and worried about fitting in. Now she belonged here as much as anyone else. "Miss Sullivan?" A young woman approached her in the lobby. "I'm Andrea Martinez, the conference coordinator. We're so excited to have you here." "Thank you for inviting me," Margaret replied, shaking Andrea's hand. "I have to tell you, when we announced your session, it sold out within hours. There's tremendous interest in your story." Andrea's expression grew more serious. "Many of our attendees are in situations similar to yours. They're looking for hope." That evening, Margaret attended the welcome reception, where she met other speakers and attendees. She found herself in conversation with a woman named Helen Rodriguez, who ran a nonprofit helping women escape financial abuse. "Your case has become legendary in our circles," Helen told her over wine and appetizers. "Not just because you protected yourself, but because you turned the tables so completely. You went from victim to victor in a way that's inspired hundreds of women to take action in their own lives." "I never intended to be an inspiration," Margaret said honestly. "I was just trying to survive." "That's exactly why you are one. You showed that survival isn't passive, it's strategic." The next morning, Margaret stood backstage waiting for her introduction, listening to the crowd of over 800 women settling into their seats. Her stomach fluttered with nerves, but they were good nerves, the kind that came from knowing you had something important to say. "Ladies, please welcome Margaret Sullivan, founder of Sullivan Property Management and our keynote speaker for this morning's session on Building Wealth in Plain Sight." Margaret walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. Looking out at the sea of faces, she saw women of all ages, some young and just starting their careers, others her age or older, many wearing expressions of quiet desperation she recognized from her own mirror not so long ago. 8 months ago, Margaret began, I was introduced to a doctor as Mrs. Richard Coleman, the wife of a successful businessman. Today, I stand before you as Margaret Sullivan, CEO of a company managing millions in real estate assets. The difference isn't just a name change, it's a complete transformation of how I see myself and how the world sees me. She told her story with unflinching honesty, the years of making herself smaller, the gradual erosion of her own identity, the moment she discovered Richard's betrayal, and the strategic ways she had taken back control of her life. For 15 years, I was building wealth while my husband assumed I was just paying household bills. He never asked what I did with my time because he didn't think what I did mattered. That assumption became his downfall and my salvation. Margaret clicked to her next slide, showing a graph of her investment returns over the past decade. This is what financial independence looks like when you build it quietly and strategically. I wasn't just hiding money, I was building an empire that no one could take away from me. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. But here's what I want you to understand, the money wasn't the real power. The real power was remembering who I was before I made myself small for someone else's comfort. The real power was realizing that I had never stopped being that capable, intelligent woman, I had just hidden her so well that even I forgot she existed. During the question and answer session, a woman in her 40s raised her hand. "Ms. Sullivan, what would you say to someone who's afraid to start building financial independence because they're worried about their spouse's reaction?" Margaret paused, thinking carefully about her answer. "I would say that anyone who is threatened by your financial independence doesn't have your best interests at heart. A partner who loves you wants you to be secure and empowered. Someone who wants to keep you dependent isn't protecting you, they're controlling you. Another woman asked, "Did you ever feel guilty about keeping your financial activities secret?" "No," Margaret replied firmly. "I felt guilty for 30 years about taking up space, having opinions, and wanting things for myself. I'm done feeling guilty for being smart, capable, and financially savvy. Those are strengths, not character flaws." After her speech, Margaret was surrounded by women wanting to share their stories, ask for advice, or simply thank her for giving them hope. One elderly woman, probably in her 70s, pressed a business card into Margaret's hand. "I'm starting over at 73, the woman said. "My husband died last year and left me nothing but debt. Your story showed me it's not too late to build something for myself." Margaret was deeply moved. It's never too late to start writing your own story. That afternoon, Margaret received a call from a literary agent who had been in the audience. "Ms. Sullivan, I'd like to discuss the possibility of you writing a book about your experience. There's clearly a huge audience for this story, and I think it could help millions of women." Margaret considered the offer as she flew home that evening. A book would mean sharing even more of her personal story, but it might also provide the roadmap other women needed to find their own paths to independence. When she arrived home, Margaret found an envelope waiting for her, a thick, formal document. From the U.S. Attorney's Office. Inside was a letter informing her that Richard's conviction had been upheld on appeal and that her cooperation in the investigation had been invaluable to protecting other potential victims. The letter also included a check, her share of the recovered assets from Richard's schemes. It wasn't a huge amount, but it represented justice in tangible form. Margaret deposited the check the next morning and used it to establish the Sullivan Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing financial literacy education and emergency assistance to women leaving abusive relationships. A month later, Margaret was in her office when her assistant buzzed her with an unexpected visitor. Jessica Morrison stood in the doorway, looking nervous but determined. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," Jessica said. "I wanted to thank you in person and ask for your advice." Margaret gestured for her to sit down. "How are you doing, Jessica?" "Better than I expected. I'm working as a paralegal now, specializing in white-collar crime cases. My experience with Richard's fraud made me realize I want to help catch people like him." Jessica paused. "I also wanted to apologize for the things I said when I first came to your house. I was so naive about what he was really doing." "You were young and in love with someone who was lying to you," Margaret replied. "We've all made mistakes in the name of love. What I don't understand is how you stayed so calm through everything. How did you know what to do?" Margaret leaned back in her chair. "I think I stayed calm because for the first time in 30 years, I was finally being honest about who I really was. Once I stopped pretending to be the helpless wife Richard wanted me to be, everything else fell into place." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about going back to school for my law degree. Do you think that's a good idea?" "I think you should do whatever makes you feel powerful and authentic," Margaret replied. "And I think you'd make an excellent lawyer." As summer turned to fall, Margaret's business continued to expand. She had acquired 12 properties in the past 6 months and was in negotiations for her largest purchase yet, a historic apartment building that she planned to renovate into affordable housing for seniors. The building held special significance because it was located on the same street where she had worked as a young marketing coordinator 30 years ago. Buying it felt like reclaiming not just property, but a piece of her own history. On a crisp October morning, Margaret stood on the steps of the building with the construction crew, reviewing renovation plans. Her phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Saw the article about you in Forbes. Mom and Dad are so proud they're showing it to everyone at the grocery store." Margaret smiled, thinking about how far she had come from the woman who had been afraid to question her husband's business decisions. The Forbes article had been titled, "The Secret Millionaire: How One Woman Built an Empire in Plain Sight," and it had brought inquiries from investors around the country who wanted to work with her. That evening, Margaret hosted a dinner party at her home, the first social gathering she had organized for her own friends rather than Richard's business associates. Linda and David were there, along with Diana Walsh, Tom Brennan, and several of her new business associates. As she looked around the table at these people who knew and respected her for who she really was, Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what authentic success looked like, being surrounded by people who valued your mind, your character, and your friendship. "I'd like to propose a toast," Tom said, raising his wine glass. "To Margaret Sullivan, who proved that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate a smart woman." "To second chances," added Diana. "To write your own story," Margaret said, raising her own glass. As her guests laughed and talked around her dining room table, Margaret stepped outside to her garden for a moment of quiet reflection. The roses she had planted over the years were dormant now, preparing for winter, but their roots ran deep and strong beneath the soil. In the spring, they would bloom again, more beautiful than ever. 1 year after Richard's sentencing, Margaret received an unexpected call that would change her life once again. The caller introduced herself as Victoria Chen, a producer from a major television network. "Miss Sullivan, we'd like to create a documentary about your story. We believe it could be incredibly powerful for women across the country to see how you transformed your life." Margaret was intrigued but cautious. "What kind of documentary?" "A feature-length film focusing on financial empowerment and the hidden strength of women who've been underestimated. We've been following your story since the Forbes article, and we think it represents something larger than just one woman's experience." The conversation led to a meeting the following week in New York City. Margaret found herself in a sleek conference room overlooking Manhattan, surrounded by producers, directors, and executives who saw her story as inspiration for millions of women worldwide. "We're not interested in exploiting your personal pain," Victoria assured her. "We want to show the strategic brilliance of what you accomplished and how other women can apply similar principles to their own lives." Margaret agreed to the documentary, but with conditions. She wanted creative control over how her story was told, and she insisted that a portion of any profits go to organizations helping women achieve financial independence. Back home, Margaret threw herself into the documentary project while continuing to expand her business empire. Sullivan Property Management now owned 18 properties across 3 states, and Margaret had been approached by pension funds and institutional investors wanting her to manage larger portfolios. The documentary crew spent weeks filming at Margaret's properties, interviewing her employees, and capturing the day-to-day operations of her company. They also interviewed some of the women Margaret had inspired through her speaking engagements. One particularly moving segment featured Maria Santos, a single mother who had attended Margaret's Atlanta speech and subsequently started her own small real estate investment company using the strategies Margaret had outlined. "Margaret showed me that you don't need a business degree or millions of dollars to start building wealth," Maria told the camera. "You just need to start, and you need to be smarter than people expect you to be." During the filming process, Margaret was contacted by prosecutors handling a related case. It seemed Richard's fraud scheme had been larger than anyone initially realized, with tentacles reaching into several other states. The investigators wanted Margaret's help understanding the full scope of his deception. "Your ex-husband was more sophisticated than we originally thought," Detective Sarah Williams explained during a meeting at Margaret's office. "The patterns you identified helped us uncover similar schemes he was running in Florida and Texas. We estimate he defrauded investors of nearly $15 million total." Margaret wasn't surprised. Richard was always good at making people believe what served his purposes. "I just learned to look past the performance to see the reality underneath." The detective's investigation led to the recovery of additional assets, which meant more money for defrauded investors and additional charges against Richard. His 5-year sentence was extended to 8 years, and he was ordered to pay restitution that would likely keep him in debt for the rest of his life. Margaret felt no satisfaction in Richard's extended punishment. She had moved so far beyond their shared past that his fate seemed irrelevant to her current life. She was more interested in the documentary's potential to help other women than in Richard's legal troubles. The film, titled The Invisible Empire, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to standing ovations and immediate distribution deals. Margaret attended the premiere with Linda, Diana Walsh, and Tom Brennan, feeling surreal about seeing her life story projected on a large screen. "It's strange watching actors portray the worst period of your life," Margaret whispered to Linda during the screening. "But look what you built from those ashes," Linda whispered back. "You turned betrayal into triumph." The documentary's success led to more speaking opportunities, media interviews, and business propositions than Margaret could handle. She hired a publicist and expanded her staff to manage the increased demand for her time and expertise. More importantly, the film sparked a national conversation about women's financial empowerment. Margaret received thousands of letters and emails from women sharing their own stories of financial abuse, hidden assets, and the journey toward independence. One letter that particularly moved her came from a 70-year-old woman named Dorothy Fletcher. "Dear Ms. Sullivan, I watched your documentary 3 times before I found the courage to leave my husband of 45 years. Like you, I had been secretly saving money for decades. Your story showed me that it's never too late to choose yourself. I'm now living in a beautiful apartment I bought with my secret savings, and for the first time in my adult life, I'm happy." Reading stories like Dorothy's reinforced Margaret's decision to continue sharing her experience publicly. Despite the personal cost of having her private life scrutinized, the success of the documentary also brought new business opportunities. Margaret was invited to join the board of directors for a major investment firm, marking her transition from successful entrepreneur to recognized industry leader. At the board meeting, she found herself the only woman among 12 members, but she no longer felt intimidated by such situations. Margaret, who had once worried about fitting in, had been replaced by someone who knew she belonged wherever her expertise was valued. Ms. Sullivan, the chairman addressed her during her first meeting, your track record in residential real estate investment is impressive, but we're curious about your thoughts on commercial development. Margaret had prepared for this question. Commercial development requires the same fundamental principles as residential investment: understanding market dynamics, recognizing undervalued opportunities, and maintaining focus on long-term returns rather than quick profits. The scale is different, but the strategy remains sound. Her answer led to an offer to head the firm's new sustainable development division, a role that would involve managing a $200 million fund focused on environmentally responsible real estate projects. Margaret accepted the position but negotiated to maintain her own company while taking on the new responsibilities. She had learned never to put all her professional eggs in one basket, no matter how attractive the opportunity appeared. 2 years after the documentary's release, Margaret was invited to speak at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Standing before an audience of global leaders, she reflected on how far she had traveled from the kitchen where Richard had dismissed her concerns about their anniversary party budget. Financial empowerment isn't just about individual success, she told the assembled crowd. When women have economic independence, entire communities benefit. Children have better opportunities, families are more stable, and societies are more resilient. Her speech was quoted in financial publications worldwide and led to consulting opportunities with governments seeking to improve women's economic participation. The success, however, came with unexpected challenges. Margaret's increased public profile attracted unwanted attention, including harassment from men who resented her message of female empowerment. She was forced to hire security and became more cautious about her public appearances. More troubling was the way some people tried to reduce her story to a simple revenge narrative. Magazine articles with titles like "How She Destroyed Her Cheating Husband" missed the point entirely, focusing on Richard's downfall rather than Margaret's strategic brilliance and business acumen. It was never about destroying Richard, Margaret explained during a television interview. It was about saving myself. His destruction was a consequence of his own choices, not my goal. Despite these frustrations, Margaret continued building her empire and helping other women find their own paths to independence. The Sullivan Foundation had grown into a nationally recognized organization, providing financial education and emergency assistance to thousands of women each year. On a quiet Sunday evening 3 years after Richard's sentencing, Margaret sat in her home office reviewing applications for the foundation's newest program, microloans for women starting their own businesses. Each application represented someone taking control of their financial future, and Margaret felt deep satisfaction in being able to provide the support these women needed. Her phone rang with a call from an unknown international number. Curious, she answered. Ms. Sullivan? This is Elena Petrov calling from Moscow. I saw your documentary, and I wondered if you might consider speaking at our Women's Economic Summit next month. Margaret listened as Elena explained that The Invisible Empire had been translated into dozens of languages and was inspiring women worldwide to take control of their financial destinies. Your story has become a symbol of what's possible when women stop accepting limitations imposed by others, Elena continued. We have over 2,000 women registered for our conference, and they specifically requested that we invite you. Margaret accepted the invitation, realizing that her personal story had evolved into something much larger, a global movement of women refusing to remain financially invisible. As she ended the call and returned to reviewing loan applications, Margaret marveled at the unexpected trajectory her life had taken. The woman who had once measured her worth by how well she served breakfast had become an international symbol of female empowerment and financial independence. Standing in her garden under the stars that night, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The roses around her slept peacefully in the winter darkness, their roots deep and strong, preparing for another season of growth and beauty. At 55, Margaret Sullivan had built something that would outlast her, a legacy of empowerment that would inspire women for generations to come. She had transformed personal betrayal into global inspiration, proving that sometimes the most devastating losses become the foundation for extraordinary victories. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if celebrating the woman who had refused to remain invisible and had shown the world what quiet strength could accomplish when finally unleashed. 5 years had passed since Richard's initial sentencing, and Margaret's influence had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. Sullivan Property Management had evolved into Sullivan Enterprises, a multifaceted company with divisions in real estate, investment management, and financial education. The company now employed over 200 people across 6 states, many of them women who had found new careers through Margaret's mentorship programs. Margaret's personal wealth had grown exponentially, but more importantly to her, so had her impact. The Sullivan Institute, an expansion of her original foundation, had opened 3 residential campuses where women could live while completing intensive financial literacy and entrepreneurship programs. Each campus housed 50 women at a time, providing not just education but also childcare, counseling, and job placement services. The success stories emerging from these programs filled Margaret's office walls. Photos of women who had started their own businesses, bought their first homes, or escaped abusive relationships lined the corridors, each representing a life transformed through financial empowerment. One particularly memorable graduate was Samantha Burke, a former nurse who had discovered her husband's gambling addiction had destroyed their finances. Through the Sullivan Institute's program, Samantha had learned real estate investment strategies and now owned a successful property management company in Phoenix. "Margaret didn't just teach me about money," Samantha had said during a recent Institute gala. "She taught me that I could trust myself to make smart decisions. That was the real gift." The Institute's success had attracted attention from policymakers, and Margaret found herself testifying before congressional committees about women's economic empowerment and the need for better financial education in schools. "Financial literacy isn't a luxury," she told the Senate Banking Committee during one hearing. "It's a fundamental life skill that determines whether someone can build security or remain vulnerable to exploitation. We're failing our daughters when we don't teach them to be financially independent." Her testimony led to the passage of the Financial Empowerment Education Act, which mandated financial literacy courses in all public high schools and provided funding for adult education programs. Margaret was invited to the White House when the president signed the bill into law. Standing in the Oval Office, watching the president's pen move across the legislation she had helped inspire, Margaret thought about the woman she had been just 7 years earlier, afraid to question her husband's financial decisions, unaware of her own capabilities. The transformation seemed impossible, yet here she was, watching national policy change because of work that had started with her personal pain. The international speaking circuit had also evolved into something more substantial. Margaret had been approached by the United Nations to develop a global initiative on women's economic empowerment. The program, called Invisible No More, was launched in 12 countries with funding from major corporations and governments. The UN position required Margaret to spend significant time traveling, but she found the work energizing rather than exhausting. In rural Bangladesh, she met women who were using microfinance to start textile cooperatives. In Kenya, she visited female entrepreneurs who had built thriving agricultural businesses with small loans and business training. "The principles are the same everywhere," Margaret observed during a video call with her executive team from her hotel in Nairobi. "Women everywhere have untapped potential. They just need access to capital, education, and the confidence to believe in themselves." Her work with the UN had also brought her into contact with other influential women leaders. She had developed friendships with former heads of state, Nobel Prize winners, and business titans who shared her commitment to advancing women's opportunities. These relationships had led to her next major venture, the Global Women's Investment Fund, a $2 billion initiative designed to provide capital for women-owned businesses worldwide. Margaret served as the fund's chairwoman, overseeing investments that ranged from tech startups in Silicon Valley to clean energy projects in developing nations. The fund's first major success had been an investment in a women-led company developing affordable water purification systems for rural communities. The technology was now being used in over 30 countries, providing clean water to millions of people while generating substantial returns for investors. "Impact and profit aren't mutually exclusive," Margaret explained during a presentation to potential investors in London. "When you invest in women-led initiatives, you're investing in solutions that address real human needs while building sustainable businesses." Her London presentation had been attended by members of the British royal family, and she had been subsequently invited to Buckingham Palace for a private dinner discussing women's economic issues. The conversation had been so productive that she was asked to advise on a new royal foundation focused on female entrepreneurship. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Margaret's story continued to inspire new generations of women. The Invisible Empire had been adapted into a Broadway musical, with Margaret serving as an executive producer. The show's opening night had been a celebration not just of theatrical achievement but of the movement Margaret had helped create. The musical's success led to additional adaptations, including a young adult novel series and a graphic novel that had become popular in schools. Margaret was amazed to see her story reaching teenagers who were just beginning to think about their futures. I get letters from 15-year-old girls telling me they're already starting investment accounts, Margaret told an interviewer from Teen Vogue. That's the real victory. The next generation will never accept financial dependence as normal. The media attention, while mostly positive, had also brought challenges. Margaret had been forced to deal with stalkers, death threats from men's rights extremists, and constant scrutiny of her personal life. She had learned to accept security as a necessary part of her public role, though she never became comfortable with the loss of privacy. More difficult to handle was the way some people tried to use her story for their own agendas. Politicians who had never supported women's rights suddenly wanted to be photographed with her. Financial companies used her image in advertisements without permission. She had been forced to develop a legal team solely to protect her intellectual property and personal brand. Success makes you a target, Diana Walsh, still her primary lawyer after all these years, had warned her. Everyone wants to claim a piece of what you've built. Despite these challenges, Margaret remained committed to her mission. The Sullivan Institute had expanded internationally, with campuses opening in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Each location was adapted to local conditions but maintained the core principle of empowering women through financial education and entrepreneurship training. The Institute's research division had also become influential, publishing studies on women's economic participation that were cited by academics and policymakers worldwide. Their annual report on the economic impact of female entrepreneurship had become essential reading for anyone working on gender equality issues. Margaret's personal life had also evolved during these busy years. She had begun dating Dr. Michael Harrison, an economics professor at the local university who shared her passion for financial education. Unlike Richard, Michael celebrated Margaret's success and intelligence, often serving as a sounding board for her ideas and strategies. "I love watching you work," Michael had told her during a quiet evening at home. "You have this ability to see connections and possibilities that other people miss. It's like watching an artist create a masterpiece." Their relationship was built on mutual respect and shared values, a partnership of equals that Margaret had never experienced before. When Michael proposed during a vacation in Tuscany, Margaret accepted with joy but also insisted on a prenuptial agreement that protected both their assets. "I'm not the same woman who entered marriage 30 years ago with blind trust," she had explained to Linda, who was serving as her maid of honor. "This time, I'm entering marriage as an equal partner with my eyes wide open." The wedding was a small, intimate affair held in Margaret's garden among the roses she had tended for so many years. The guest list included her closest friends, family, and professional colleagues, people who knew and valued the real Margaret Sullivan. As she exchanged vows with Michael, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The betrayal that had once seemed like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of her real life. She had learned that happiness wasn't something someone else could give or take away, it was something she could build for herself. Richard, meanwhile, had been released from prison after serving 6 years of his 8-year sentence. He had attempted to contact Margaret several times through intermediaries, claiming he wanted to apologize and make amends. Margaret had politely but firmly declined all such overtures. "I harbor no anger toward Richard," she had explained to a journalist who asked about her feelings toward her ex-husband. "But I also have no interest in reliving the past. My focus is entirely on the future I'm building." Richard's post-prison life had been difficult. His criminal record made it impossible for him to work in real estate or finance, and his reputation preceded him wherever he went. He had reportedly taken a job as a sales clerk at a furniture store, living in a small apartment and struggling to pay his restitution obligations. Jessica Morrison, in contrast, had thrived. She had completed law school and was now working as a prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime. She had reached out to Margaret occasionally over the years, updating her on her progress and expressing continued gratitude for Margaret's guidance during the darkest period of her life. "I learned that being naive isn't the same as being innocent," Jessica had written in her most recent email. "Your example showed me that women can be strong without being cynical, and smart without being cruel." As Margaret approached her 60th birthday, she began thinking about legacy in new ways. The businesses she had built were thriving, the foundations were changing lives, and the movement she had helped create had taken on a life of its own. But she wanted to ensure that her work would continue long after she was gone. She had begun working with her legal team to create a comprehensive succession plan that would transfer control of her various enterprises to the women who had helped build them. The Sullivan Institute would be governed by a board of graduates, ensuring that the people who had benefited from the programs would guide their future development. "I don't want this to become a monument to Margaret Sullivan," she had told her board of directors during a recent planning session. I want it to be a living, growing force for women's empowerment that adapts to changing needs and continues to innovate. The succession planning had also led her to increase her philanthropic giving. She had pledged to donate 90% of her wealth to causes supporting women's economic empowerment, following the example of other billionaire philanthropists, while maintaining enough resources to ensure her own security and independence. Standing in her garden on a warm spring evening, surrounded by the roses that had witnessed her entire transformation, Margaret marveled at the life she had built. From the ashes of betrayal. The scared, dependent woman who had discovered her husband's bigamy seemed like a character from someone else's story. At 60, Margaret Sullivan was recognized as one of the most influential women in the world. Her net worth exceeded $1 billion. Her companies employed thousands of people, and her foundations had helped hundreds of thousands of women achieve financial independence. World leaders sought her advice, universities awarded her honorary degrees, and her autobiography had become an international bestseller. But more than any external recognition, Margaret treasured the knowledge that she had turned her pain into purpose and her personal victory into a global movement. She had proven that it's never too late to discover your true potential, never too late to start over, and never too late to change not just your own life but the lives of countless others. The roses around her bloomed magnificently in the spring twilight, their beauty a testament to careful tending, patient growth, and the strength that comes from deep roots. They had weathered storms, survived harsh winters, and emerged each spring more beautiful than before, just like the woman who had planted them, and just like the millions of women around the world who had found the courage to bloom in their own gardens of possibility. As Margaret entered her 62nd year, an unexpected opportunity arose that would test everything she had built and learned. The World Bank approached her with an unprecedented proposal to lead a global initiative worth $50 billion aimed at eliminating female poverty worldwide within a single generation. Ms. Sullivan, Dr. Amara Okafor, the World Bank's managing director, explained during their meeting in Washington, D.C., "Your track record of creating sustainable, scalable solutions for women's economic empowerment makes you uniquely qualified to oversee this initiative. We're talking about reaching 1 billion women across 80 countries." The scope was staggering. The program would encompass everything from microfinance in rural villages to venture capital funds for women entrepreneurs in major cities. It would require coordination between governments, NGOs, corporations, and grassroots organizations on an unprecedented scale. Margaret spent weeks studying the proposal, consulting with economists, development experts, and women leaders from every continent. The challenge was enormous, but so was the potential impact. If successful, the initiative could fundamentally alter the global economy by unleashing the productive potential of half the world's population. "This is bigger than anything I've attempted," Margaret confided to Michael during one of their evening walks. "It would mean restructuring my entire life around this mission." "Do you want to do it?" Michael asked, stopping to face her under a streetlight. Margaret considered the question carefully. She had built a comfortable, successful life. She could continue growing her existing enterprises, enjoy her marriage, and make a significant but manageable impact. Taking on the World Bank initiative would mean constant travel, enormous pressure, and the risk of very public failure. "Yes," she said finally. "I think this is why everything else happened. All the preparation, all the learning, all the building, it was leading to this moment." Margaret accepted the position as Director General of the Global Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative, becoming the first woman to hold such a high-ranking operational role at the World Bank. The announcement made headlines worldwide, with economists and development experts either praising the choice or questioning whether someone without traditional international development credentials could handle such a massive undertaking. Margaret's first major decision was to restructure the initiative around a principle she called local expertise, global resources. Instead of imposing top-down solutions, the program would identify and support existing women's organizations in each target country, providing them with capital, training, and technology while allowing them to design culturally appropriate interventions. She spent her first 6 months in the role traveling to every continent, meeting with women leaders, government officials, and potential partners. In rural Bangladesh, she sat with village women who had formed savings circles to fund small businesses. In Sao Paulo, she visited a favela where women had created a cooperative that manufactured solar panels for their community. "The solutions already exist," Margaret explained during her first quarterly report to the World Bank's Board of Directors. "Women everywhere are innovating and creating economic opportunities despite barriers. Our job isn't to teach them what to do, it's to remove the obstacles that prevent them from scaling their success." Her approach initially faced resistance from traditional development economists who preferred standardized, measurable interventions. Margaret had to fight battles within the World Bank itself, defending her methodology against critics who wanted more conventional metrics and control mechanisms. The turning point came during a heated board meeting where Margaret was challenged by a veteran economist who questioned her soft approach to development. "Mr. Kellerman," Margaret responded calmly, "you've been implementing traditional development programs for 30 years. In that time, the percentage of women living in extreme poverty has barely changed. I'm suggesting we try something different, trusting women to know what they need and empowering them to achieve it." She clicked to her next slide, showing preliminary results from the first 12 pilot programs. In 6 months, these initiatives have reached 100,000 women. Average income increases are 40%, and 80% of participants have expanded their businesses or started new ones. These aren't just statistics, they represent families lifted out of poverty and communities strengthened through women's economic participation. The data was undeniable. Board opposition began to crumble as more results came in from pilot programs around the world. Women were not just meeting but exceeding every target metric while creating innovations that program designers had never anticipated. In Kenya, women farmers had used program funding to develop a mobile app that connected rural producers directly with urban consumers, eliminating exploitative middlemen. In Peru, indigenous women had created a certification system for traditional textiles that was now generating premium prices in international markets. Margaret's second year as Director General brought global recognition for the initiative's success. The program had reached over 2 million women across 40 countries, generating over $8 billion in new economic activity. More importantly, the model was being replicated by other organizations and governments, multiplying its impact far beyond the original scope. The success attracted attention from tech billionaires and major corporations seeking to align their philanthropic efforts with proven models. Margaret found herself negotiating partnerships with companies like Microsoft, which provided technology infrastructure, and pharmaceutical companies that offered healthcare programs for women entrepreneurs. One of the most significant partnerships came from an unexpected source, a consortium of women billionaires who had formed their own funding initiative. Led by tech entrepreneur Patricia Kim and media mogul Sofia Rodriguez, the group committed $20 billion to expand Margaret's model into developed countries where women face different but equally real economic barriers. Margaret's work proves that investing in women isn't charity, it's the smartest economic strategy available, Patricia explained during the partnership announcement. "We want to bring these same principles to Silicon Valley, where women entrepreneurs still struggle to access venture capital." The partnership led to the creation of Margaret's most ambitious project yet, the Global Women's Economic Network, a digital platform connecting women entrepreneurs, investors, mentors, and resources across all continents. The platform used artificial intelligence to match women with opportunities, translate languages in real time, and provide customized business education based on individual needs and cultural contexts. Within its first year, the platform had registered 5 million users and facilitated over $1 billion in investments, loans, and business partnerships. Women in rural Tanzania were selling handmade goods to customers in Tokyo. Female engineers in Bangalore were mentoring teenage programmers in Detroit. Mexican artists were collaborating with designers in Paris. "We've created the first truly global economy for women," Margaret observed during a virtual conference celebrating the platform's first anniversary. "Geography is no longer destiny. A woman's potential is no longer limited by where she happens to be born." Margaret's work at the World Bank had also changed her personally. The constant exposure to women overcoming extraordinary obstacles had deepened her appreciation for her own journey and strengthened her resolve to continue pushing boundaries. During a visit to refugee camps in Jordan, she met Fatima al-Hassan, a Syrian doctor who had fled the war with nothing but her medical knowledge. Using a microloan from Margaret's program, Fatima had started a mobile clinic serving refugee women and children. Her success had inspired other refugee professionals to start their own businesses, creating a thriving entrepreneurial ecosystem within the camps. Dr. Al-Hassan, Margaret said during their meeting, "Your courage in rebuilding your life reminds me that resilience isn't just about surviving tragedy, it's about transforming it into something that serves others." Fatima smiled and replied in careful English, "Mrs. Sullivan, your story gave me permission to believe that starting over at 50 was possible. Now I help other women believe it too." These encounters reinforced Margaret's belief that her personal story had become something larger than herself, a symbol of what was possible when women refused to accept limitations imposed by others. As Margaret approached her 65th birthday, she began planning her next transition. The World Bank initiative was thriving under her leadership, but she knew that sustainable change required strong institutions that could outlast any individual leader. She had been grooming a diverse team of women leaders from around the world to take over various aspects of the program. Her chosen successor was Dr. Priya Sharma, an economist from India who had transformed that country's microfinance sector. Before joining Margaret's team, Dr. Sharma combined brilliant analytical skills with deep cultural sensitivity and an unwavering commitment to women's empowerment. Priya understands something that took me decades to learn, Margaret told the selection committee. Real change happens when you empower local women to solve their own problems rather than imposing external solutions. She'll take this program to places I never could. Margaret's departure from the World Bank was marked by a global celebration of her achievements. The United Nations declared the date of her retirement as International Women's Economic Empowerment Day, and women's organizations worldwide organized events highlighting her legacy, but Margaret's retirement was anything but passive. She had decided to return to her roots by writing and teaching, accepting a position as Distinguished Professor of Women's Economic Leadership at Harvard Business School. Her courses on entrepreneurship after adversity and building wealth in plain sight became the most popular offerings at the school, with waiting lists that stretched for years. Margaret's Harvard classes were unlike anything the business school had ever seen. She invited women from all walks of life to share their stories, former welfare recipients who had built million-dollar companies, immigrants who had started businesses with nothing but determination, and women who had left abusive relationships to create independent lives. Business school traditionally teaches you to optimize known systems, Margaret told her first class of MBA students. I'm here to teach you to create entirely new systems when the existing ones don't serve you. Her teaching methodology emphasized real-world application over theoretical frameworks. Students were required to identify women in their communities who needed business mentoring and spend the semester helping them develop viable enterprises. The program created hundreds of new women-owned businesses while giving future business leaders hands-on experience in inclusive economic development. Margaret also used her Harvard platform to launch her most personal project, the Richard Coleman Memorial Fund for Men's Rehabilitation. Named with deliberate irony after her ex-husband, the fund provided education and counseling for men whose crimes had been motivated by their inability to accept women's independence and success. Patriarchy hurts everyone, Margaret explained. During the fund's launch event, men who feel threatened by women's success are trapped in a system that ultimately diminishes their own humanity. If we want lasting change, we need to help men learn new ways of relating to powerful women. The fund worked with prisons, domestic violence organizations, and men's groups to provide education about healthy relationships, financial responsibility, and emotional intelligence. While controversial, the program showed promising results in reducing recidivism and domestic violence among participants. Richard himself had been invited to participate in the program after his release from prison, but he had declined. Margaret learned through mutual acquaintances that he had struggled to rebuild his life, taking a series of low-paying jobs and living in a small apartment outside the city. His attempts to restart his real estate career had failed due to his criminal record and reputation. Margaret felt no satisfaction in Richard's struggles, but she also felt no obligation to help him. He had made his choices and would have to live with the consequences. Her focus remained entirely on helping other women avoid the trap of financial dependence that had made his betrayal so devastating. As Margaret settled into her late 60s, she found unexpected joy in the role of mentor and grandmother figure to the next generation of women leaders. Many of the girls who had read her young adult novels were now entering college and careers, and they sought her advice on everything from negotiating salaries to starting businesses. Margaret established monthly wisdom circles at her home, where young women could gather to discuss their ambitions, challenges, and dreams. These informal sessions often proved more valuable than formal mentoring programs, as participants learned as much from each other as from Margaret's guidance. Success isn't a destination, Margaret told one group of 20-somethings gathered in her garden among the roses that had witnessed her entire transformation. It's a process of continuously becoming more authentically yourself while using your gifts to serve something larger than your own needs. One participant, a recent college graduate named Amanda, raised her hand. Ms. Sullivan, how do you balance ambition with relationships? I worry that being too successful will make it hard to find a partner. Margaret smiled, remembering her own younger self's fears about being too much for men to handle. Amanda, any man who is threatened by your success isn't worthy of sharing your life. The right partner will celebrate your achievements and support your continued growth. Never make yourself smaller to accommodate someone else's insecurity. These conversations reinforced Margaret's belief that each generation of women built on the progress of those who came before. The young women in her circles took for granted opportunities that Margaret's generation had fought to create, and they were pushing boundaries that Margaret could barely imagine, standing in her garden on a warm summer evening, watching the sunset Paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The betrayed wife who had discovered her husband's bigamy 30 years ago seemed like a character from another lifetime. At 68, Margaret Sullivan had become a legend in her own time, a symbol of what was possible when women refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on them. Her businesses continued to thrive under new leadership, her foundations were changing lives around the world, and her story continued to inspire women across generations and cultures. But perhaps her greatest achievement was the simple fact that she had learned to love and trust herself completely. She had discovered that true security didn't come from being protected by someone else, but from knowing that she could handle whatever challenges life might bring. The roses around her swayed gently in the evening breeze, their perfume filling the air with the scent of growth and possibility. They had been planted by a woman who thought her life was over, tended by someone who was rediscovering her strength, and now bloomed for a woman who had learned that every ending was actually a beginning in disguise. Margaret Sullivan's story was far from over. As long as there were women who needed to know that transformation was possible, that it was never too late to start again, and that betrayal could become the foundation for triumph, her legacy would continue to grow and flourish, like the roses. In her garden, some of the most beautiful blooms came from plants that had weathered the harshest storms and emerged stronger, more resilient, and more magnificent than anyone had ever imagined possible. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.